Either way, role-playing games have not always been widely embraced. In fact, at first, there were many conservatives who viewed them as a gateway to devil worship. In 1982, in his first starring role, Tom Hanks played the lead in Mazes and Monsters, a movie where the main character breaks with reality due to an RPG. He ultimately believes he's living inside his imagined game. He stabs a mugger and becomes suicidal before his friends finally manage to save him, although even they can't convince him to come back to sanity. Parents in the late 70s and early 80s were warned of the evils of the game and cautioned against letting their children play it. Real-life instances were identified where people followed the Tom Hanks route, supposedly, having mental breakdowns due to losing themselves in a fantasy. Of course, this suspicion of RPGs and the insistence by the general public on keeping it at arm's length reminds me of a similar pattern that seems to crop up whenever something new is taking the world by storm. During my days in college studying literature, I remember reading about how people had viewed novels as seedy and potentially corruptive. Just look at Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey, where Catherine's reading of Gothic novels leads her to see murders where none exist. Of course, Austen was herself critiquing the argument of her day that too much reading could corrupt susceptible women. But how far off is that from the argument that Tom Hanks is going to start murdering people the second he picks up a 20-sided die? Look at the other new forms of art: movies, cartoons, video games, graphic novels, virtual reality. There's a transitory time where the status quo seems to want to fight back against what it sees as an affront to the way things are. There's a similar lag that often occurs in academia, where the popular can't really be viewed as art until it's been properly aged by a few decades. That said, RPGs didn't make the process any easier on itself, in large part due to how inaccessible the rules tended to be at first. Thankfully, role-playing games have come a long way since the first edition of Dungeons & Dragons. That early version had many things in it that were, frankly, baffling for most players. Much of those initial editions of the rules were focused on statistical charts to the point that many non-fans would easily go cross-eyed trying to keep track of it all. If you're not well steeped in the history of RPGs and you want to cure a bad case of insomnia, try to get an RPG fan to explain to you the ins and outs of Thaco sometime. You'll be snoozing in no time. But from those days of statistical tables and die roll after die roll, RPGs have branched out and flourished. Don't get me wrong, there are still rule sets out there that would make a trained statistician start scratching their head. But they've now been joined by other platforms that allow for a much broader range of rule implementation, to the point where you have games where you don't roll a die at all. If RPGs stayed in the world of pen and paper, however, they might not have made my personal cut for New Commons nominee. But since Dungeons & Dragons first broke into the scene, role-playing games have made huge strides into practically every corner of our media. There are straight-up digital adaptations of them, whether open-ended affairs like Neverwinter Nights or pre-scripted versions of a D&D module. The Baldur's Gate series is a prime example of those. There are numerous novels set in some of the realms the Dungeons & Dragons game occupies. R.A. Salvatore's Drizzt Do'Urden series and Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman's Dragonlance Chronicles are still coming out with new entries, decades after they began. But even setting aside the literal adaptations of the Dungeons & Dragons rule set, it's seeped into many other areas. Video games perhaps make the easiest comparison, as designers took the constraints of character building and storylines and inserted them into their media to make them that much more compelling. These games are far beyond the days of Super Mario Bros. Or Sonic, with the hugely popular, massively online role-playing game World of Warcraft leading the way. These days, character creation is something that can happen in games that don't even really feel like RPGs. Football or soccer games, or Mii's on the Nintendo platform. When you get down to it, I'd argue that fantasy sports is much closer to RPGs than the fantasy sports players would be comfortable admitting. You create a team, drafting them from real-life teams, and you follow stats and storylines just as much as you would fighting your way through the Underdark in a Forgotten Realms campaign. RPGs are everywhere. They are part of our culture and society, and because of their open-endedness, they invite continual innovation and participation. What's the definition of a commons, according to the New Commons Project? A commons is something that belongs to all of us, a communally held resource from which no one can be excluded and for which we are all responsible.